Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on your lunch break today. I'm Giselle Cuff from the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre, and I am going to be hosting you and chairing today for our first lunchtime seminar in quite some time. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping first before we kick off because we've got lots to get through. So just going to welcome you all and explain quickly. Mics and cameras are going to be off by default, but there is going to be a chat function. So please feel free to put down any questions that you have whilst the presentation's ongoing, and we will try and get through as many as we can at the end. We are recording the presentation and it's going to be made available online afterwards, including the Q&A. But just to give you a bit of reassurance, your questions on the chat will be anonymous. The chat won't be included in that recording. If you would, in the Q&A, like to come off camera and ask your question orally, that's absolutely fine. Please just pop your hand up and we can facilitate that. But otherwise, we will pick through your questions when we get to the Q&A section. So just another quick bit of housekeeping in terms of meeting rules. Owen is going to drop these in the sidebar for us. I'm hoping that those are quite straightforward and common sense for everyone, but those are designed to just keep a safe and productive environment here for us all, including for people with lived experience of modern slavery that might be joining us today. So in short, please just be sensitive and respectful. I hope that I don't have to remind any of you of those. So to dive in, because we've got quite a lot to get through, the research that we're going to hear about today analyses the National Referral Mechanism statistics to explore what they can tell us about the ways in which changes in policy and legislation may be impacting on decision making and how many people are formally recognised as survivors of modern slavery. Dr. Patrick Burland and his colleagues at the International Organisation for Migration UK are producing 3 bespoke briefings funded by the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. These briefings deep dive on specific areas of the NRM statistics. These include a briefing on reasons for negative conclusive grounds decisions, data on reconsiderations of negative NRM decisions, and analysis of geographical areas of referrals. Today's lunchtime seminar is going to focus on the first 2 of those briefings, the second one of which is now live as of this morning, and I will ask Owen to drop the link into the sidebar for you as well, so you can be having a look at that. So briefly, the research found that decisions made by the Immigration Enforcement Competent Authority have a higher likelihood of receiving a negative conclusive grounds decision compared to the single competent authority. The research also highlights the high rates of referrals that do receive a positive decision after being accepted for a reconsideration, bringing along with those decisions vital access to ECAT entitlements. I'm not going to say too much because I know Patrick will cover a lot of this, but to talk about the research, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick Burland from the International Organisation for Migration onto the line. Patrick's presentation will be about 20 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So we should be able to wrap up in time for your lunch break by 12:45. And just before we start, another reminder, any questions you've got, please pop those in the chat and we will come to those shortly. So without further ado, I will hand over to Patrick for his presentation.
So the first briefing, as I said, provides context on the 1,000% increase in negative decisions. And in October 2024, the Home Office made a commitment to end the backlog of people waiting for conclusive grounds decision by the end of 2026, and ultimately making ever larger numbers of negative conclusive grounds decisions will ultimately be decisive to whether that commitment is achieved. These 2 briefings provide timely evidence and recommendations given the ongoing discussions around reform to NRM policy and legislation, and the analysis of data on reconsidered NRM decisions in particular is highly pertinent given recent reforms to policy on reconsideration requests and some high-profile discussion about this policy area. But I want to start first with the briefing on the negative conclusive grounds decisions. So this graph will show us the number of negative CG decisions made every quarter between January 2020 and September 2025 by each of the 4 recorded reasons for a negative decision, and these are recorded as in the Home Office's data on the NRM. And so the reasons are that the case was not credible, that the case had not met the definition, meaning the definition of human trafficking, slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour. A third reason is where both of those reasons apply. And finally, there is a reason that there was insufficient information to meet the standard of proof required. And the standard then is on the balance of probabilities. And the government modern slavery guidance explains that this means that modern slavery is more likely than not to have happened. The standard of proof does not require the relevant competent authority to be certain that the event has occurred. So let's now start to look at the numbers for these decisions, starting with negative conclusive grounds decisions due to credibility issues. So we can see that these peaked in 2023, have fallen in 2024, and have fallen again further still in the first 9 months of this year. So I've now just added the number of decisions which were recorded as being both not credible and not met the definition, but the number of such decisions here is so small that you will not probably be able to see them without getting extremely close, getting out your magnifying glasses to see that data. And then next is the number of negative decisions made because the case did not meet the definition. So these started to increase in late 2023 and early 2024 and have remained at a similar scale through 2025. But finally, I want to add decisions which were recorded as negative because of insufficient information to meet the standard of proof required, starting with Q1 2020 to Q3 2022. So here we see a relatively small number of such decisions. This was the third most common reason of the 4 for issuing a negative conclusive grounds decision during this period of time. Moving forwards to mid-2023, we can start to see these becoming more significant in volume. But finally, let us look at what's happened with these decisions since this time. So what has happened is there's been a 3,000% increase in such decisions in 2024 compared to 2022. That's 10 times the near 300% total increase for all other decisions in that period. And as we can see, negative decisions on the grounds of insufficient information to meet the standard of proof required have remained very high throughout 2025. And so the first briefing examines significant policy changes at the end of 2022 and start of 2023, which correlate with the rise in negative decisions due to insufficient information. These include changes to the section on evidence gathering at conclusive ground stage in the Modern Slavery Act statutory guidance, such as the introduction of short deadlines for providing information, and changes to the requirement for gathering and using evidence for decision making. In addition, the briefing highlights the abolition of the multi-agency assurance panels in December 22, which reviewed negative conclusive grounds decisions made by the Home Office, and which, among other things, were able to recommend that the Home Office seek further information before issuing a decision. The briefing analyses key factors associated with the 3 most common reasons. The reason you can't see there on the screen was too small for any meaningful analysis. Now, the data analysis was done using a binary logistic regression model to predict the odds of receiving each of the reasons for a negative CG decision. Now, nearly 10,000 cases were analysed, and the sample consisted of every case referred to the NRM between 2020 and 2024, which had a reason for a negative decision, negative CG decision recorded. And the analysis considers factors such as nationality, exploitation type, age, first responder, competent authority in association with each of those types of decisions. Now, the results discussed here and in the briefing all had strong statistical significance, which means essentially that there's a very low probability that those results had occurred by chance. And it's important to know that the briefing has a lot more detail about the methodology in closer detail. But now I want to move on to the key findings and recommendations related to these 3 reasons. So the analysis found that NRM referrals were 1.53 times more likely to receive a negative decision due to insufficient information if they'd been referred by a government agency than non-government agency. The government agency here is almost entirely comprised of 3 Home Office bodies: UK Visas and Immigration, UK Border Force, and Immigration Enforcement. The analysis also found that cases decided by the Immigration Enforcement Competent Authority were 2.67 times more likely to receive a negative CG decision for insufficient information than cases decided by the SCA. And now this likelihood occurs after controlling for all the other variables examined. The finding is consistent with a 2024 report by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration on the ICA, which highlighted a number of challenges with the gathering of information for decision making. So in response to this, we have a number of recommendations. Firstly, we recommend that the Home Office considers assessing the capacity of its own first responders to be able to make these high quality referrals and provide decision makers with further information as required, and to follow up the necessary capacity building that is needed. And then, given the ICA's cohort of cases includes people in prison and detention, there's an ongoing need to examine and improve sharing and access of information for people in circumstances where accessing, sharing, and receiving information and evidence related to their case is going to be the most challenging. Now, cases recorded as not specified or unknown exploitation type were 2.44 times more likely to receive this type of negative decision. Now, not specified or unknown exploitation type was the fourth most recorded type of exploitation for referrals between 2020 and 2024. Nearly 7,800 cases were recorded in that way. That's more than the number of cases that were recorded as having exclusively experienced sexual exploitation during that period of time. Now, I don't think that there's that many people being referred to the NRM where a first responder is not able to identify a type of exploitation falling under categories like criminal or labor or sexual exploitation. And the hypothesis discussed in the briefing, based on review of Home Office documents, is that many of these cases are likely being recorded as not specified or unknown because the individual being referred hasn't actually experienced exploitation at the time of referral. The UK official modern slavery guidance rightly explains that a person is a victim even if they haven't been exploited yet, and they highlight examples where people are identified during a police raid before any exploitation has actually occurred. Now, however, if the hypothesis discussed in the briefing is correct, then it raises questions about how decisions are made for such persons and whether this is fully understood and incorporated into guidance and procedures for decision making. So in response to this, we have a number of recommendations, starting with the recommendation that the Home Office considers amending the NRM referral form to allow for reporting of cases where an individual is at risk of a particular form of exploitation, rather than recording that when it is known as not specified or unknown. Separating data on people who were exploited from people who were going to be exploited could provide some valuable insights to inform future prevention efforts. We also recommend publishing an anonymized analysis of the types of responses in the free text fields. So this type of case is recorded in this way when a free text field is used, and being able to understand what types of responses are being entered here would help us to identify more earlier new and emerging trends of exploitation which may be occurring. Moving on to the not credible decisions, so we found that there was a 78% increase in the likelihood of males receiving this decision. And the briefing makes a number of recommendations in response to this, highlighting the need for more research to better understand particular challenges around disclosure, gender stereotypes for males, and changes to the guidance to enhance the discussion around challenges for males in disclosure, given this is only really limited to the context of sexual exploitation currently. So moving on to the reconsideration briefing, this briefing looks at data on reconsiderations between January 2021 and June 2025, which is the period that data was available for when we produced the briefing. The briefing looks at the numbers and outcomes of reconsidered decisions by common nationalities, first responders, age, gender, and competent authorities. So a reconsideration is where an individual or someone on their behalf requests that a negative decision from the NRM is reconsidered. The request can only be made on the basis that there is additional evidence which is not available when the original decision was made, or where there are specific concerns that a decision was not made in line with the official guidance. The request will then be reviewed by the same competent authority that made the decision, and if they accept the request, a decision maker will look at the case and issue a new decision, which will either be positive or negative. The data on reconsidered decisions is only for reconsideration requests which were accepted, there is no publicly available data which shows us how many requests were initially rejected. So we may know that there's been an enormous increase in the number of negative reasonable grounds decisions being made every quarter since the start of 2023. And reconsidered decisions will only take place when there are negative decisions. So let's look at how the number of how the number of reconsidered decisions for negative reasonable grounds decisions has changed over time. So the numbers still seem quite low. So a helpful way to kind of understand, well, what's happening proportionally is to add a third element here, a third line. So I want to introduce a line which shows us a percentage figure, and you can see that percentage scale on the right hand side on the vertical axis. And this line shows us the number of reconsidered decisions as a percentage of the number of negative decisions. So to kind of explain more clearly, if there were 100 negative reasonable grounds decisions and 10 reconsidered reasonable grounds decisions, that percentage figure would be 10%. So what the graph here shows us with this line is that the proportion of negative decisions being reconsidered is mostly lower than it was before the start of 2023. We look at the historical comparison between 2022 to the 2024-2025 period, where that rate is mostly below 10%. So about 1 in 10 negative reasonable grounds decisions appears to be being reconsidered. If we look at the same data in regards to conclusive grounds decisions, so we've already seen earlier in the presentation the increase in the number of negative conclusive grounds decisions. Let's look at what's happened with reconsidered conclusive grounds decisions. And then again, to add the third element, the line as I did with the reasonable grounds decisions, we can see the proportion of those decisions being reconsidered. And here we can see on the right hand side, the vertical axis, that percentage. So here we see a much sharper fall in the proportion of negative conclusive grounds decisions which appear to be being reconsidered. Actually, in the first quarter on the graph here, quarter 1, 2021, the number of reconsidered conclusive grounds decisions was 85% of the total number of negative conclusive grounds decisions issued in that quarter. So the current rate over the last couple of years is around half of the historical average for reconsidered decisions. So proportionally fewer people are having a negative conclusive grounds decision reconsidered. And so the briefing considers some of the reasons for this in terms of policy changes, which help us to understand what's been going on. So the briefing looks at two particular changes in policy from February 2024, which were made in the Modern Slavery Act statutory guidance, which we felt were particularly significant. So firstly, the timeline to submit a request for a reconsideration of a decision not made in line with the guidance was reduced from 90 days to 30 days. So that 90 days had been set as that's aligned with the time normally available for judicial review. This was reduced to 30 days. And then an additional timeline of 30 days was introduced to submit a reconsideration based on new evidence. Now, prior to February 2024, there was no time limit for this to be made. This seemed to reflect and acknowledge that new information may not always become available within the matter of a small number of days. So what are the key findings, just some of the key findings from the briefing on reconsideration requests? So we found that immigration enforcement is overrepresented as a first responder for reconsideration requests for reasonable grounds decisions. We also found a marked difference in the percentage of reconsidered reasonable grounds decisions which were positive between males and females. So 83% of reconsidered reasonable grounds decisions were positive for females compared to just 67% for males. Now this is particularly interesting given that, as I've already mentioned, there is an initial screening process. So a request for reconsideration will be made, and only if it is accepted will the decision go on to being reconsidered. So all of these males and females would have gone through that initial assessment process, and it seems at this second stage a significant difference emerges. But perhaps most striking is the data that shows over 650 people who were initially given a negative reasonable grounds decision went on to receive a positive conclusive grounds decision. About 70% of the reconsidered decisions were positive, And so this is quite a stark highlight for us, given if you consider the difference between an individual who initially is given a negative reasonable grounds decision, which essentially makes them unable to access the specialist support and assistance provided by the UK government. They then go on to have that decision reconsidered, and then ultimately are given a positive conclusive grounds decision, which officially and formally recognises them as a survivor of modern slavery. The short-term and long-term differences between an individual refused or unable to access assistance with that person who is ultimately fully recognised is hard to overstate just how significant those differences would be for that individual. The final data graph I want to show is one which shows us the percentages of all decisions and reconsidered decisions which are positive at both reasonable grounds and conclusive grounds stage. So the blue line charts the percentage of the positive decisions, and the yellow line charts the percentage of reconsidered decisions which are positive. So starting on the left, we have the reasonable grounds, and on the right, we have the conclusive grounds. And in both decision points, since 2023, the rate of positive decisions at reconsideration stage are becoming significantly higher than they are for all initial decisions. So finally, to say the recommendations we have from the briefing highlight on reconsiderations the need for the Home Office to consider removing the 30-day time limit to submit a reconsideration request, to return to a focus on the material importance of new evidence rather than when this evidence has become available, and to consider restoring the 3-month window for requests where a decision has not been made in line with the guidance, and that the Home Office should withdraw changes to the statutory guidance, which is since September 2025, which prevents certain people from being able to access reconsideration requests. The briefing shows us that only a very small proportion of negative decisions are being reconsidered, and a large majority of those which are reconsidered are given a positive decision. Given this, reforms to modern slavery policy should be strengthening the ability for people to have a negative decision reconsidered rather than the reverse. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. And well done for making the time back after a rocky IT start. So thank you so much. So I know there's quite a lot in there to unpack, but we've had some great questions in the sidebar, which I will kick off with. My camera might be a bit slow, but I'm hoping that you can still hear me. So first question for you, Patrick, was one that I think you can probably answer. When a negative decision is initially given, so this is on the reconsiderations, and it's then given a positive after a recon, someone had asked what types of evidence or narratives were originally missed, and are those oversights preventable? So I suppose, does the data tell us what was missed, and do you think the data tells us whether that's preventable?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it's an important question, and it's one which we would like to try and understand more from the analysis that we've done. There are some, it seems possible with the data to be able to better understand that more clearly. So currently, if a decision, when a decision is reconsidered, it is not possible, if a decision is reconsidered and then becomes positive, it won't be possible to see what the initial decision was given for in terms of negative grounds. So, for example, if a person has a decision which is initially negative on the grounds of insufficient information, if that decision is then reconsidered and is given a positive decision, that there will no longer be data in the data set which shows that decision as initially being recorded as a negative. So we in the briefing, we had some recommendations for some revisions to the way the data is presented and recorded, but would give us a much greater understanding of the particular reasons given, and being able to see how many of those decisions were challenged because of a lack of information and were then reconsidered positively. That may start to suggest, well, there was additional information that provided, and would put more of an emphasis on the need for ensuring that individuals have sufficient time and given sufficient opportunity to provide the evidence to give a conclusive grounds decision with some confidence.
Thanks, Patrick. That's really helpful. And I'm going to just jump ahead because there's been a couple of related points asked in the sidebar. So there's one question just to follow up on that. I think where someone has reflected that they've worked on RG decision reconsiderations before, where the initial NRM was woefully inadequate. That's a quote. And I think it's been commented that perhaps that's not just a training issue, and maybe it's about those people not having enough time to pull together that information. So just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think with the data, obviously there are some limitations in what we can really understand about the individual, like the detail and context of each case. The data, with the quantitative data we have, we can sort of see what is happening, but we can't always understand exactly why something is happening. I think, but the other issue with this is that we don't have the data on the number of reconsideration requests that are being made and not accepted. So these types of cases may often be the most, clearly cases where there are the most clearest issues or clearest challenges. And so they present a particular sort of subset of decisions where there have been the most limitations. We also had to consider that there has been a huge increase and effort to bring in many more first decision makers into the competent authority. And so there are a lot of people who have been training and learning and engaging in this who maybe have less experience, less knowledge. And we also know that there have been numerous changes to guidance. We can see in one of the slides there is a spike in reconsidered decisions at RG stage in between July and September 2023, which likely reflects the changes in the changes to the objective evidence requirement that were introduced earlier that year. So there's a lot happening in policy, which then creates challenges for decision makers. So there are many variables, and unfortunately, we're only able to really identify and grasp just a small number of them.
Thanks, Patrick. And last comment perhaps around that 30-day time limits. I know it's been mentioned a few times in the chat bar, but I know that Home Office have released statistics today on the conclusive grounds decision backlog that looks to have dramatically decreased. So I know there's been talk of there perhaps not being enough time under that 30-day time limit. And there is a recommendation in the report that that 30-day time limit should be extended or removed. Could removing the limit perhaps risk an increase in the backlog of the NRM decisions again? What are your thoughts around that risk?
Yeah, so that is like you said, that's a recommendation that features in the briefing. The backlog has fallen substantially since its peak. I think the data today shows a backlog of around 6,500 compared to more than 20,000 previously. As highlighted in the first briefing and earlier in the presentation, a lot of those decisions, there's a lot of negative decisions being issued because of a lack of sufficient information to meet the standard. And I think with these with this change, historically the backlog is currently much smaller, much lower, but what is the purpose? What is the reason? Why are we concerned about the backlog being long? We're concerned about the backlog being long historically because people are waiting incredibly long periods of time without any certainty, without any ability to predict and to support their integration and recovery, and support workers are unable to kind of give a sense of exit plan, move on, preparation for individuals. And an individual may wait hundreds and hundreds of days and then suddenly out of nowhere receive that decision. So for me, the prioritization of the backlog is about ensuring the support, the dignity, the recovery, the psychological safety, the well-being of those individuals in the NRM. And if individuals have to wait, if there is a delay or a slight increase in the waiting times for decisions, because efforts were made to ensure that actually we gave the right decision, that is, I feel like, should be the priority, right? And as highlighted, there are more than 650 people, a relatively small proportion of a tiny proportion of the more than 100,000 referrals in the last 10 years, but a substantive proportion of those who actually had a reconsideration, for those individuals, there is a life-changing outcome. And I think it's important for us to think about this when we're thinking about huge data and huge numbers, but the backlog, clearing the backlog, is human beings waiting for decisions on whether or not they have been a victim or survivor of modern slavery. And I think it's really important that everyone has that opportunity to show and to be able to demonstrate, and for arbitrary timelines shouldn't be the distinction, but determine whether or not a person who has the right to support and assistance or not.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks a lot. So loads of questions coming in. I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. There's been an interesting question and a few questions about data that's available to you, which you might be able to get into. So there's been a specific comment around how the SCA and IECA won't serve decisions to asylum accommodation, NRM decisions, I'm guessing that means, which can often mean that a survivor is at risk of not actually being informed directly of the decision. So there's a question, if there is any data on whether people that haven't had their decision served to them are likely to be granted a reconsideration request alongside an extension. I suppose the bigger question there is there any data on the reasons that people are or are not granted a reconsideration request?
No, there isn't any publicly available data just on the volume of those cases or the kind of reasons for doing so. The Modern Slavery Act statutory guidance sets out some of the process and the requirements and how that should be managed internally by the decision makers who review and assess, and how they communicate those decisions. And so I think it's a case of understanding if there are opportunities for more or sharing of anonymized data around this, or for better explanation in the guidance on the particular reasons that would be communicated and the context in which that would take place.
Thanks, Patrick. And I am aware we've probably gone quite heavy on the reconsideration questions, but probably quite timely given the recent announcements. I did just want to follow up with a really interesting question again about data that's available, data that's not available, future research perhaps. There's a specific question about whether language barriers or cultural misunderstanding was considered as a variable that might be influencing negative decisions. And then I suppose as a linked question, did you observe any national origin trends in this research that you were doing? So any specific language barriers or cultural misunderstanding coming through as a variable that might be influencing negative decisions, and generally any national origin trends?
It's a important question, and I think unfortunately, that is something which may be happening, but is not identifiable in the data that we're able to analyze. We're just able to examine the kind of data that's presented in the NRM statistics. That data does, however, show, and in the briefing we highlight, like I said, we've highlighted just a few of the most key findings, which are maybe more relevant to the current and ongoing policy discussions. But we do look at, we highlight some of the findings regarding, say, Albanian and Vietnamese nationals and their probability of receiving negative decisions due to credibility issues. I think maybe if that's question is also alluding or thinking about the context of why there's been a huge spike in insufficient information, and clearly in issues around language or barriers would be problematic for getting that information. Is that a factor for why information is not available? And it's clearly going to be a challenge for an individual to substantiate or to show the type of information maybe that a decision maker needs or wants to make that decision. But that has always been present. There's always been those barriers, those language challenges, those cultural challenges. They haven't suddenly emerged. There hasn't been a change in the population, the demographics of people coming to the NRM since 2023, 2024, which are substantive to show why there's been a huge increase in those not being able to provide sufficient information. What we highlight and sort of explain or show in the briefing is just the extent to which the policy has changed in a way that it is far easier for decisions now to be made on that basis than it was before.
Thanks, Patrick. And I'm going to be cheeky and squeezing one final question before I do a very quick wrapping up. And this is probably thematically and from a context point of view, very relevant at the minute, from a timing point of view. So given the recent government policy announcements on immigration system reforms, do you think any of your findings in both of these briefings could be used to inform the discussions about abuse of the NRM system?
Yeah, thank you. So I think with that, the data, and not just this data, but other data in the past and other research, both qualitative and quantitative, has highlighted, a very low number of cases that are being found to have credibility challenges. We have, the government began collecting data on those, what it defines as bad faith claims, and those remain incredibly low in the overall scale and are easily identifiable within the decision of the trained first responders who understand how to identify and recognize survivors of modern slavery, and there's existing safeguards that exist for ensuring that the NRM is serving those who it is intended to be able to support. I think particularly the findings around insufficient information are relevant to the ongoing policy discussions, but also in terms of questions around identifying and defining what is a victim of modern slavery in the modern slavery consultation was published by the Home Office recently. I think the point we raise around the huge volume of cases which are recorded as not specified or unknown seems very strange, given the whole point of trafficking and modern slavery is that exploitation is taking place. So for that not to be able to be identified, if that is a huge gap in our ability to understand and to have a clearer sense about what the nature of trafficking looks like in the UK. And I think obviously on the reconsiderations briefings, we really show that a very small proportion of negative decisions are being reconsidered, with a very high volume of those that are reconsidered being positive, which we think really should give pause for thought around the best way to proceed with ensuring access to that important policy.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And I think you've probably done my job for me on closing reflections there in tying everything together. So thank you so much for all of your hard work and IOM's hard work on these briefings. Thanks for joining us today and being so generous with your time. Thank you everyone for joining us for our first lunchtime seminar to kick back off our series. So hopefully you'll be seeing more of us. Keep your eye out on our newsletter for further ones being advertised. And the third briefing in this series is likely to be landing in January, which will be on geographical areas of NRM referrals. With that said, I'll thank you all and let you go on with your lunch break, and hopefully we'll see you soon.